December of 1914 had settled over the Western Front like a gray blanket. The sky hadn't remembered the sun in weeks. A thin layer of fog hung between the German and British trenches, hovering above that narrow, deadly strip of land. The mud was knee-deep, yet even the mud felt warm compared to the frozen life the soldiers were living. On the British line, a young soldier named Thomas Elwood held a rusted tin cup filled with cold tea, staring at his trembling fingers. The wind slipping through the trench walls cut straight into his bones, but what chilled him most wasn't the cold. It was the ache for home. When he remembered the smell of the warm bread his mother baked for Christmas, he wished he could forget where he was, but the mortar blast echoing a few meters away pulled him back into harsh reality. Right beside him, a bearded sergeant whose whiskers were half frozen pulled his brown blanket tighter around his shoulders. "They'll freeze us to death before this winter ends, mark my words." Thomas smiled, though it never reached his eyes. No one was in the mood to be cheered up. A voice had risen earlier from the German trenches, though no one had understood it. It was strange thinking that German soldiers were fighting the same cold, the same hunger. Enemy or not, they were still human. They carried the same fears, the same longing. Thomas glanced over his shoulder toward no man's land, maybe 30 yards of emptiness. By day it belonged to bullets, by night it belonged to silence. But tonight, something felt different. The air was softer, the wind quieter, as if even the war had grown tired and wanted to rest. At the other end of the line, in the German trenches, a young Saxon soldier named Friedrich Keller was trying to warm his feet by drying his socks with a tiny match. The weak flame flickered, ready to die, until Friedrich cupped his hands around it. "Don't leave me," he muttered. "Not now." The small flame cast a faint orange glow on his face. For a moment, it reminded him of the lanterns back home. His mother, his sister, the little wooden toys beneath the Christmas tree. The memories rushed over him like a wave. He thought about the last night before he left for the war. The warm room, the whole family gathered around the table. Now, the table had become mud, and the lanterns had turned into bullets striking the trench walls. Friedrich reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin box. Inside was a tiny Christmas tree figurine made of wire. It was worth almost nothing. Yet to him, it felt like the most valuable thing in the world. His mother had given it to him. "Keep this with you," she had said. "Wherever you go, it will remind you of home." On both sides, soldiers were thinking the same thoughts. The war ending, going home, sitting at a Christmas table with their families. But none of them imagined what was coming. Within just a few hours, something would happen between those trenches. Something that would break every rule of war and leave a mark on their hearts that would last a lifetime. And as the night crept on, a strange expectation drifted over the trenches. It felt as if winter was carrying not only cold, but also a whisper of peace. The final days of December had turned the entire front into a single color, gray. The sky was gray. The earth was gray. Even the soldiers' faces had taken on a grayish hue. The sun seemed to have abandoned this land long ago. In the freezing air, every breath turned visible, each soldier exhaling the warmth of his lungs in pale clouds. Thomas crouched at the edge of the trench, rubbing his fingers together to warm them. No matter how hard he tried, the cold seeped beneath his skin and into his bones. Beside him, a sergeant grumbled while staring at the sky. December used to mean Christmas shopping and a warm fireplace. Now it simply means surviving another day without freezing. Thomas knew exactly what he meant: the crackling fireplace at home. The smell of apple and cinnamon, his sisters running around, they all felt like scenes from another life. In the German trench, Friedrich waited for the guard rotation with the others. Everyone had lifted their coat collars, trying to shield themselves from the cold. The bread from their rations had turned rock hard. One soldier shook a metal tea can. "The water's frozen," he muttered. "Looks like we'll be breaking ice to drink." Friedrich tried to smile, but the frozen muscles on his face wouldn't obey. If even tea froze, how long could hope survive? At that moment, the wind rose over no man's land. The barbed wire shivered, turning its metallic rattle into an eerie melody in the quiet night. For a brief moment, both sides wondered the same thing. What made this night feel so different? The answer lay just beyond the horizon. Unseen by anyone yet, in the British trench, Thomas's friend Jack pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his bag. A Christmas card from his mother. Its edges were water damaged, yet the drawings were still visible. A church, a shining star, snow-covered trees. "I wish we could place a tree like that in our trench," Jack said. "Maybe it wouldn't feel so dark here." Thomas studied the card. "Sometimes darkness settles inside," he whispered, "and sometimes it comes from outside. I'm not sure which is worse." In the German trench, Friedrich's commander paced impatiently. "Stay alert. The British could attack at any moment." But Friedrich knew. The British feared the same thing. Throughout the long night, a heavy fog settled over the trenches. Footsteps, heavy breaths, distant artillery rumbles. Time itself felt frozen, but the end of this night would not resemble the others, and no one knew. Within a few hours, these trenches would awaken to a night humanity would never forget. The cold wind drifting over the trenches on the night of December 24th had finally calmed for a moment. The moon slipped in and out of the clouds, casting faint, trembling lines of light over the snow-covered no man's land. This night felt different from all the others. Even the tension inside the soldiers seemed to soften with the wind. Thomas stood guard at the edge of the British trench. His hand was stiff with cold as he gripped his rifle, but his mind was far away. In London at Christmas time, children singing in the streets, red ribbons glowing in shop windows, the smell of chocolate drifting from bakeries. He remembered it all. His eyes warmed for a moment, but he forced the feeling down. There wasn't much room for emotion in war, at least that's what they were told. Then he heard a strange sound coming from the opposite trench. He raised his head and listened. At first it was nothing more than a hum. He thought it was just the wind pushing around some distant noise, but soon he realized it wasn't the wind at all. A melody. Faint, distant, yet unmistakably a melody. Thomas frowned. Jack touched his shoulder. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Thomas nodded. All along the trench, the soldiers were listening. The sound grew clearer. German words cut through the frozen air and drifted toward them. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. A chill ran through Thomas. It was Silent Night, the same hymn sung every Christmas, only in German. The British soldiers lifted their heads, something they would never dare do on any ordinary night. But tonight, the guns were silent. Even the sky felt like it was listening. A warm yellow glow rose from the German trench. First one candle, then another, then more. Small Christmas trees had been placed along the trench walls. Their trembling flames glowed softly in the darkness, making the battlefield look less like a war zone and more like a village holiday gathering. Thomas held his breath. He hadn't expected anything like this. The Germans began singing again, louder this time, their voices blending beautifully in the cold air. "They're celebrating Christmas," Jack whispered. A British soldier smiled shyly. Enemy or not, Christmas is Christmas. Then something no one expected happened. One of the British soldiers replied, "Silent Night, Holy Night." The two songs overlapped at first, then slowly began to harmonize. The Germans paused to listen, then continued in their own language. It felt as if two choirs, separated by a strip of frozen earth, were singing together. Friedrich, leaning against the trench wall bathed in candlelight, closed his eyes and felt briefly transported home, to warmth, family, safety. A deep stillness settled over the trenches. No gunfire, no screams, only human voices. Why, the purest sound in the world. Thomas felt something rise inside him as he listened to the silence. Maybe no one will die tonight. But he didn't know. This was only the beginning. A far greater miracle was just moments away. As the echoes of the song slowly rose above the trenches, even the biting cold of the night couldn't erase the strange warmth of the moment. After the German hymns came the English response, an invisible bridge stretching between the two sides. No one knew why such a gentle moment had appeared in the middle of war, but everyone could feel that this was no ordinary night. Thomas leaned against the earthen wall of the trench, watching the opposite side closely. Candlelight still flickered from the German lines, and the melody continued as a soft hum. But then, he noticed movement. At first, it seemed like a hallucination. Someone from the German trench was stepping carefully onto the snow-covered ground. He wore a heavy coat and held up a white cloth. Not like a surrender flag, but more like a greeting. Thomas's heart sped up. "Jack, look," he whispered. Jack's eyes widened. Is he out of his mind? He'll get shot for sure. But no one fired. No one even reached for the trigger. The German soldier took a few more steps into no man's land, then stopped, raised his hands and called out, "Nicht schießen, don't shoot!" His voice trembled slightly, but it was sincere. This was the most human sound to break the deathly silence in weeks. There was movement on the British side. Some soldiers gripped their weapons tighter. Others hesitantly rose to their feet. Thomas's heart pounded as if it might burst. "Don't go," the sergeant barked. "It could be a trap." But it didn't feel like one. Because at that moment, two more soldiers stepped out from another section of the German trench, also holding pieces of white cloth. The candles were still burning, the singing still drifting softly between the lines. This didn't look like an ambush. It looked like a celebration. Jack tugged on Thomas's arm. Some of ours are going out too. Indeed, a few British soldiers were slowly climbing out of the trench. They carried no weapons, only faces filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. Each step asked a silent question. Are they truly friendly tonight? Or is there a shadow waiting to deceive us? Thomas couldn't fight the urge inside him. He climbed up out of the trench. Even though the sergeant yelled after him, he no longer heard the words. The wind stung his cheeks as he stepped into the open ground. Jack followed close behind. Soon, no man's land was filled with soldiers from both sides, taking cautious steps toward each other. A few more steps, a few more breaths, and they were only meters apart. No one drew a weapon, no one shouted. Everyone simply stared as if asking, "Is this really happening?" A German soldier walked toward Thomas. There was a faint smile on his face. He lifted his hand. "Hello," he said. "Christmas." For a moment, Thomas couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat. Finally, he nodded. "Yes. Christmas." The two soldiers extended their hands. A brief hesitation. Then they shook hands. This was the true beginning of the night. With that handshake, all the fear, all the anger, all the orders faded into the background. For a few hours, the war surrendered to humanity. When Thomas saw the shy smile on the face of the German soldier shaking his hand, all the heaviness in his chest lifted for a moment. This man might have aimed a rifle at him just a few days earlier. Yet now, his freezing hand radiated a warmth like that of a friend. With the songs, candlelight, and footsteps echoing across the snow, the word enemy had lost its meaning entirely. The German soldier introduced himself. "Friedrich Keller." Thomas responded in the same calm tone. "Thomas Elwood." The two young men stood in silence for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because most things they could say would only remind them of the absurdity of war. So instead of speaking, they continued their dialogue with simple gestures. Friedrich pulled a small metal tin from his pocket. It was filled with tobacco. Smiling, he offered it to Thomas. Thomas took it with surprise. "Thank you," he said. "Our cigarettes ran out long ago." Friedrich shrugged. "Ours aren't very good either," he said in a half-English, half-German mix. Meanwhile, soldiers from both sides were gathering in the middle of no man's land. Some pulled biscuits from their pockets, others chocolate, others tiny gifts sent from home. It was as if everyone was remembering a long-lost skill, behaving like normal human beings. Jack approached them with a grin, pipe in hand. "Look," he said. "A German gave me some cookies they made themselves. Tastes a little strange, but at least it's a cookie." A German soldier tried to understand the English jokes, and when he couldn't, he just laughed anyway. The languages were different, but the laughter was the same. Not far behind them, two groups were comparing items from their metal ration tins. One held homemade sausage, the other a can of jam. The soldiers exchanged them with cheerful curiosity. Friedrich showed Thomas the tiny Christmas tree figurine he carried. "Von meiner Mutter," he said, touching his chest. "Home. Memory." Thomas smiled and pulled out a slightly water-damaged card his family had sent him. On it was a silly snowman drawn by his sisters. Friedrich examined it carefully. "Sehr schön." "Sehr schön," he said. "Beautiful." Both young men were holding on to the same thing in this frozen land far from home. A small piece of hope. Then, in the middle of the crowd, an older British soldier tested the strings on the guitar he had brought with him. Everyone fell silent. The wood was covered with the grime of war, but the first note that rang out cut through the night like a spring emerging from the frozen earth. As the guitar melody rose, one of the German soldiers pulled out a harmonica. The two instruments blended beautifully, and the soldier's eyes brightened. Within seconds, both Germans and British began singing the same hymn. Stille Nacht, silent night. Voices united, languages united, humanity united. This created the greatest paradox of the war. Men who had been brought here to kill one another were now standing side by side singing. Along the trench edges, the officers watched in stunned silence, but none dared interrupt. Because what they were witnessing was not a breach of command. It was a miracle. Thomas and Friedrich looked at each other. "Maybe one day," Thomas said, "this madness will end." Friedrich smiled, his breath turning white in the frozen air. "Maybe. It starts tonight." And truly, for that one night, humanity managed to crack the iron walls of war, even if only for a few precious hours. The silence that followed the songs turned no man's land into something almost sacred. Candles still flickered with trembling flames, and the guitar and harmonica notes slowly faded into the cold wind. The soldiers could feel, unmistakably, that they were standing in the middle of a miracle born inside a war. Thomas noticed a few soldiers crouched on the ground, busy with something, and walked over out of curiosity. Jack waved at him excitedly. "Thomas, look at this! You're not going to believe what they're doing!" When Thomas got closer, he saw two British soldiers rolling and tightening old cloth scraps from their bags. A few German soldiers were gathered around them, laughing as they watched. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. Jack grinned widely and pulled something from behind his back. "We're making a ball! We're going to play football!" Friedrich raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "Foosball?" he asked. "Really? Foosball?" Thomas laughed. "Yes, tonight anything is possible, isn't it?" In no time, dozens of soldiers from both sides built small goals out of stones. The uneven stone piles stuck into the mud became their makeshift nets. German and British soldiers quickly formed teams. A rough, imaginary center line drawn across the muddy snow marked the boundary of the field. The first whistle, if it could be called that, came from an elderly German soldier who blew into an empty shell casing, producing a ridiculous noise. Everyone burst into laughter. A British soldier kicked off the first play. Mud splashed, shouts rose. Then a big German soldier stole the ball and ran forward, his footsteps thudding loudly on the snowy ground. "Stop him! Stop him!" Jack yelled, but it was too late. The German soldier shot the ball forward. It hit the stone goal and rolled inside. Cheers erupted from the German trench. "Tor! Tor!" they shouted. The British protested. No, that doesn't count. The ball bounced in from outside." But the Germans laughed and teased them more. On the next attack, Thomas stepped in. He dashed forward, nudged the ball ahead of him, mud flying everywhere. As two German soldiers moved in on him, Thomas cut sharply to the right. "Hurry, Thomas! Show them!" Jack shouted behind him. Thomas kicked the ball toward the goal. It wasn't very strong, but the ground was slippery. It rolled, tumbled, and knocked the stones over. This time the British roared, "Goal!" Friedrich took off his gloves and shook his head with a laugh. All right, he said. "You were lucky this time." The match quickly turned into a real tournament. Everyone was covered in mud, faces flushed, breath steaming in the air, but the scene was priceless. Not enemies playing, just young men. At one point, the ball was kicked so far that it rolled right up to the barbed wire. Everyone went silent for a moment. Those wires had represented death for days. Thomas slowly approached, picked up the ball, and looked across the wires. A German soldier stood there. They shared a smile. "This is unbelievable," Thomas said, breathless. "Ja," the German soldier replied. "Nicht Krieg. Heute Spiel, not war today. Today is game." The sun had long since set, and night had fallen, but the laughter filling no man's land shone brighter than any candle. That night, a football match pierced through the darkness of war and proved that humanity was still alive. As the noise of the football match slowly faded into deep calm, soldiers sat in small groups across no man's land, trying to talk to one another even if they didn't fully understand each other's languages. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, leaving a peaceful glow over the snow-covered ground. It felt as if everything the war had killed might briefly come to life again under that soft light. Thomas knelt down and pulled out the Christmas card his family had sent him, showing it to Friedrich. "Look," he said, pointing to the edge of the drawing. "My sister drew this. The snowman's arms are a bit crooked, but I think it's adorable." Friedrich examined the card carefully. "Yes," he said with a smile. "Little sisters always draw like this. Mine used to draw the same way." "Used to?" Thomas asked. Friedrich looked away. "Before the war," he said quietly. "Now, who knows? I hope she's all right." Thomas nodded. "I hope so. For all of us." A little further away, Jack was rolling a cigarette with a German soldier. The man's heavy accent made some words hard to understand, but his gestures were so lively that Jack burst into laughter at everything he said. "Listen to this!" Jack shouted. "He's telling me how he fell off a sled into a ravine when he was a kid. Turns out even the enemy had a childhood just like ours." Nearby, soldiers shared the small keepsakes they carried. A faded photo from a lover, a medallion given by a father, a wooden toy soldier. Each was a quiet reminder that all of them once lived ordinary lives. Photo number 2. Paragraph 3. One German soldier pulled out a bottle and offered it around. "Not Glühwein," he joked, "but it will do." An English soldier sniffed it. "This isn't wine, this smells like vinegar," he said, but still took a sip, his face twisted immediately. "Brilliant! How is your stomach still alive?" Both sides burst into laughter. Then suddenly, everyone fell silent. A distant artillery sound echoed from far behind the lines. It wasn't close, but it was a reminder. A miracle was happening tonight, but even miracles did not survive until morning. Friedrich turned to Thomas and whispered, "I will never forget this night." "Me neither," Thomas said. This is a night worth remembering." They sat quietly for a while. The wind moved gently across the field. Some candles faded out, others flickered back to life. It was as if even the darkness hesitated to touch them tonight. Then a German soldier slowly stood up and began reciting a prayer in his own language. Even the English soldiers who didn't understand the words could feel the weight and sincerity of his voice. Some lowered their heads, others looked at the sky, because deep down everyone shared the same wish. Let the war end. Let us go home. Let no one die. When the prayer ended, Thomas spoke quietly. "I wish tomorrow could be like this." Friedrich closed his eyes and sighed. "I wish so too, but tomorrow, the commanders return. The war returns." The words hung in the air for a long time. Both of them knew the truth. This peace belonged only to a single night, as short as a miracle, yet worth remembering for a lifetime. And the snow-covered no man's land stood silently, witnessing a night that would be written into history. As the night went on, the cheerful expressions on the soldiers' faces slowly faded, replaced by a heavy realization. From behind the trenches came footsteps, shouted orders, and the harsh smell of authority. The officers were returning. And in their eyes, everything that had happened tonight was nothing but disobedience. The first shout came from the German side. A harsh voice echoed through the darkness, slicing through the joy like a blade. "Was ist das? Was macht ihr da? What are you doing?" Friedrich flinched. The silhouette on the trench line belonged to Colonel Schneer. The buttons of his uniform glinted with cold light, and every step he took carried anger. The colonel marched toward the area where German and British soldiers were still chatting in the middle of no man's land. The sight burned into his eyes like a stain. "Return immediately! This is a battlefield, not a playground." The soldiers exchanged glances. No one dared speak. Even Friedrich, who had been laughing moments ago, snapped back into the posture of a disciplined soldier. Thomas and Jack watched the same scene unfold from the British side. Their officers had returned as well. Major Reynolds, his face carved with frozen fury, approached the men and spoke with bitter sarcasm. "Lovely. Having a Christmas party, are we? Tell me, when one of you gets shot tomorrow, will that German you traded gifts with come save you? Back to the trenches." Jack leaned toward Thomas. "This man could get jealous of joy itself," he muttered. Thomas said nothing. When the major's eyes met his, something cold settled in his chest. The major spotted the tobacco in Thomas's hand and barked, "And what's this? A gift from the enemy?" Thomas swallowed. "Sir, it was just..." "Enough!" Major Reynolds snapped. "Back! All of you, now!" The walk back to the trenches felt like a funeral procession. The soldiers who had been singing, playing football, laughing, and forgetting their misery for a few hours were now silent. Their steps were heavy, their faces full of disappointment. As Friedrich retreated, he looked at Thomas one last time. Only a few meters separated them, but those meters suddenly felt like a massive chasm. Thomas gave him a small nod. Friedrich returned it. Both carried the same unspoken question in their eyes. Why must everything beautiful end? Back in the German trench, orders rained down immediately. Clean your weapons. Double shifts on guard duty. Everything that happened tonight will be forgotten. On the British side, it was no different. Major Reynolds shouted, "From now on, no one steps outside the trench. No talking to the enemy. Throw away the gifts. This nonsense is over." Jack tried to secretly hide the pipe he'd been given and whispered to Thomas, "They can forbid it, but we won't forget, right?" Thomas swallowed hard. "No, we won't." At that moment, both sides heard the same distant sound, the thud of artillery. A dull explosion echoed through the night. The last trace of peace drifted away with the wind. The officers believed they had restored discipline. But in truth, something inside the soldiers' hearts had changed forever. The war had returned, but after tonight, humanity would not disappear so easily. By the next morning, as the sun slowly lifted itself above the horizon, The footprints left on the snow from the night before were still visible, but the warmth they carried had already vanished into the air. No man's land was a battlefield again. The stern looks of the officers, the cold bodies of the rifles, and the tightened guard schedules all had returned. As Thomas made his way toward his post, he noticed a soldier sitting alone against the trench wall. It was Jack. He was turning the pipe he had hidden the night before, staring at it thoughtfully. "They'll start shooting again today, won't they?" Jack said without looking up. Thomas nodded quietly. "Yeah." The order came. Jack gave a bitter smile and tucked the pipe away. "When I think about laughing with them last night, pulling the trigger now turns my stomach." Meanwhile, on the German side, things were no different. Friedrich's hands trembled as he cleaned his rifle. When he touched the cold metal, he could still feel the warmth of shaking Thomas's hand as if it had left a mark on his skin. From behind, Colonel Schneer shouted, "Get ready! Reports say the British are moving. Don't blink!" Soldiers pressed themselves back into the trench walls. The artillery teams were already receiving their commands. Through the scope, Friedrich could see a few British soldiers on lookout at the front line. Everything had returned to normal. In the most painful sense, suddenly, the distant hum of a cannon rose. On the British side, someone yelled, "Incoming!" Thomas threw himself to the ground, a silent second, then a massive explosion. The shell landed just beside the area where they had played football the night before. Snow and mud shot into the air. Jack couldn't stop himself from cursing. "Yesterday we talked like human beings, and today we're tearing each other apart again. What a stupid world!" As the smoke thinned, Thomas carefully lifted his head. Near the impact crater, he spotted something on the ground. A small piece of candle left by the Germans. That candle, which had burned so brightly last night, was now half crushed in the mud, a symbol, like a wound. At the same time, Friedrich was digging through his bag. He couldn't get the image of Thomas's Christmas card out of his head. "The little snowman," he thought. "Is the child who drew it still smiling today?" Another shell sounded, much closer. It struck near the German trench. Friedrich dropped to the ground, mud splattered across his face. His ears rang. Colonel Schneer shouted, "Return fire! Open fire!" Machine guns erupted on both sides. Bullets poured across the same ground where soldiers had laughed only hours earlier. As Thomas reached for the trigger, his hand shook. Every silhouette he aimed at flickered with Friedrich's face. "I can't do it," he whispered to himself. Jack grabbed his shoulder. "None of us can, but it's the order, Thomas." Friedrich was trapped in the same torment. Each British figure in his sight turned into Thomas for a split second, tightening his chest. But hesitation meant punishment. He knew that too. The war had begun again, but nothing was the same anymore, because both sides had seen the truth. The men they called enemies were no different from themselves. That night, the gears of war began to turn again. But in the soldiers' hearts, those gears no longer fit the way they once had. Humanity had awakened, and it would not be silenced so easily. As the months of war turned into years, and those years faded into the dusty pages of history, that cold Christmas Eve of 1914 remained as a warm memory in the hearts of the soldiers. The noise of cannon fire, the echoes of screams, and the endless suffering had all returned. But the mark of that night never disappeared. When Thomas returned home, streaks of gray ran through his hair, and deep circles framed his eyes. The shadow of war didn't lift from him for a long time, but every winter, as the Christmas tree was being decorated, he would stop for a moment, put down the ornaments, and his mind would drift back to that night. Years later, when his sister asked him about it, Thomas said only one sentence: "It was the night I shook hands with someone I thought was my enemy." That handshake felt more real than all the shouting of the war. There was always a note on Thomas's desk: "Friedrich Keller, I will not forget." In truth, he had never seen Friedrich again. The war dragged them in opposite directions, and life brought its own sorrows with it. But that moment of shaking hands remained fixed in both their lives, a star that refused to fade. Meanwhile, in a small room in a home in Germany, Friedrich opened a wooden box with his aging hands. Inside was the little Christmas tree his mother had given him, and a tiny, now yellowed card, a copy of the Christmas card Thomas had shown him that night, drawn by his sisters. As Friedrich traced the corner of the card with his finger, he murmured, "For one night, we were human." As the years passed after the war, historians began to study that night. In letters, diaries, and soldier accounts, the same words appeared over and over again. A miracle. A night of peace. True humanity. Some claimed it was a legend. Some said it was exaggerated, but in the memories of English, German, and French soldiers, the same scenes appeared. Soldiers playing football on the snow, hands offering chocolate to one another. Stille Nacht, sung by candlelight. And young men shaking hands in the middle of the trenches. As time went on, the memory of that night found its place even in official ceremonies. In small towns across Britain, children reenacted the moment during Christmas time, and in Germany, teachers told students about it as one of the astonishing moments of peace. But perhaps the most touching moment came years later. In the 1930s, two elderly men sat side by side at the edge of a football field, watching a match. They did not know each other, but when their eyes met during the game, they both said the same thing at the same time. 1914. Thomas sighed. The football match. A faint smile appeared on Friedrich's face. No man's land. They didn't speak for a long while. Some memories didn't need words. Like every soldier who lived through that night, they knew this truth. Even a single night of peace was powerful enough to change the fate of humanity. Hope could find its way even in the middle of war, like a delicate flower pushing through the snow. And the Christmas Eve of 1914 was etched into history not just as a ceasefire, but as a miracle humanity would never forget.